Hello and welcome to the Sicilian defense chess opening video featuring the dragon variation and then the Yugoslav attack in the dragon variation. So I had a request by a viewer to do something on the Sicilian defense, which is a good idea because the Sicilian defense, if you look here in this database, after e4 by white, the most common move is the Sicilian defense. So, for any beginners watching, what is the Sicilian defense? Well, you just respond with c5. Now, why is this a good move? Well, you kind of prevent or discourage an immediate d4 by white because anytime that you can get both pawns in the center, that just controls a lot of space in the center. And, that can give white an advantage if black doesn't fight back in the center. So now white could still go here, but then if this pawn is captured, the queen would have to recapture here on d4. And then the knight, could attack the queen. So you develop a knight attacking the queen. The queen would have to, kind of waste time moving. So more often, what is played is the most common move here, by far, knight to f3. So you bring this knight up here, and now you can push this pawn, and if it's captured, well, then the knight can recapture. So then you're not afraid if the knight to c6 move attacks your knight, and it'll be backed up by the queen. So I'll play these common moves in the Sicilian. The most common move played by black here is d6. And you might wonder, well, what does this move accomplish? Multiple things. It allows you to develop your bishop if you need to. You can, by playing this d6 move, fortify the c3 pawn, but more importantly, you cover this square. That way, if you bring your knight to f6, and e5 is played, it can just be captured, instead of just chasing your knight around. So the most common move now is d4 in this position by white. Now, there are other moves that can be played, but because this video is going to be about the Sicilian dragon and then the Yugoslav attack variation in the dragon, that's what we'll take a look at today. You could probably do a whole YouTube channel or a chess channel just on the Sicilian defense. There's a lot going on in the Sicilian defense. So here we have d4, the most common move, and white has achieved the pawn center, the dream pawn center here. And when white does that, you want to fight back and try and take that away from white. And that's why the most common move here is to just destroy that pawn center by capturing. The knight will recapture. And now if we take a look at the position here, what is happening here? Well, if you look at the central pawns, white has, this central pawn, but he only has 1 versus 2 by black here. So, this can be an advantage for white as far as space, and there's a knight developed here. And so white wants to try and use his lead in development to try and get an attack going. Whereas if the game kind of fizzles out into an end game, black could have a long-term advantage and better control of the center with both of these central pawns, 2 versus white's single pawn in the center. So now, what is the most common move here? Well, by far, it is developing this knight because you immediately attack the unprotected pawn and force white to deal with that. And so white almost always just defends the pawn, developing a knight at the same time. And now, the most common move played here apparently is a6, which is the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian. But we're not going to go into that today. I'm going to stick with the dragon variation, which is this move here. And why is it called the dragon variation? I don't know if anybody knows for sure. Leave a comment if you've heard anything different other than the story that maybe these pawns here kind of resemble the shape of a dragon, maybe. So that could be why they named this the Sicilian dragon variation. Now, in the Sicilian, there are many variations you can play. Some are pretty wild and attacking. This one is probably more on the tactical side of the different variations you'll have in the Sicilian. So whether you're playing with white or black, you'll just have to experiment on with all the different variations and see what you like and what works for you. So after G6, we have the dragon variation where black is getting ready to develop the dragon bishop here to G7, where it'll kind of fire down through the center, aiming towards the queen side. And that can be a very powerful bishop in this Sicilian dragon variation. All right, so now the Yugoslav attack begins with bringing this bishop up here to E3. And why might you do that? Well, some of the plans in the Sicilian for white and black involve bringing the queen here for white. You create a battery. You're going to try and exchange off this good dark squared bishop that black has, eliminating one of the defenders around the king side. And I'll go into more of the plans as we show what the common moves are. Okay, so here you might be thinking, well, what if black just moves the knight up here, attacking white's bishop? Well, that would be a mistake, because if the knight moves here, you have the possibility of developing this bishop up here with check. So that would have to be dealt with, and either way, black would be in trouble. If you just bring the bishop here to block, well, then the queen could just capture the knight, because your bishop would be pinning this light squared bishop of black's to the king. So, that's one possibility. So after this knight goes here, the other possibility, if you deliver check with your light squared bishop, would be to block with the knight. But then, you could just capture that, attacking the queen. And, if there's a recapture, the bishop would capture, forking the king and the rook. So, you can kind of experiment with that, playing it out on the board or a computer or whatever on your own. But to keep the video moving along, let's see what the normal move is. The number one move played, 20,000 times versus the second most played move at 733, is to just develop the bishop here. So you develop the bishop, and now we have F3, and now the database is saying that this is the beginning of the Yugoslav attack. Now, what is the idea behind this F3 pawn move? Well, now you're keeping the bishop out of here, from attacking, and you're also setting up a potential future attack. White wants to start bringing the pawns up on the king side here, because black most likely will castle to the king side, and then you want to storm your pawns forward. In the Yugoslav attack, white will try and castle queen side, and then you'll have opposite side castling, which we'll take a look at here as we go further. All right, so F3, fortifying the E4 pawn, preparing to possibly push that G pawn in the future, keeping the knight out of the position, the bishop as well, I guess. So now the most common move is to just go ahead and castle here. So after castling, white gets ready to castle as well and normally plays this move, queen to d2, creating a battery. And Bobby Fischer was famous for saying that the Sicilian dragon, in order to beat it, all you had to do was sack, sack, mate, which meant that you would try and sack the bishop here, basically move your bishop up here, try and trade these dark squared bishops off, getting rid of a key defender for the black king, and then go after this knight, maybe by pushing a pawn in the future or bringing this knight up here and attacking. But you get rid of these two key defenders and you throw the pawns forward here, and try and develop some kind of winning checkmating attack. And so, the reality of the position is that it might not be, that easy. It depends on your opponent's defense. And so let's see how things could continue here. All right, after queen to d2, white is prepared to castle queenside. So with black to move, looks like knight to c6, just developing the knight is by far the most common move. Now, a common theme in the Sicilian is usually you don't want to go ahead with white and capture this knight here because it allows black to recapture towards the center, fortifying his center, and that could help black achieve a key strategy in the Sicilian defense, which is to play the d pawn up to d5 here. And once, as far as strategy goes in the Sicilian, once the d pawn makes it to d5, that kind of frees up black's position a little bit more and helps him get closer to equality or even maybe heading in towards a better position. Now, let's see what happens here if we continue. So the knight is just developed, putting some pressure on your knight, which is guarded, well at the moment. So now the most common move is castling queenside. So white just continues with the plan. So now there's a rook queen battery aimed up the half open d file. If the queen and bishop try and exchange out here, well, now the rook is helping to guard this knight if the queen moves and is no longer guarding it. So the game continues here. Let's see. It looks like d5 is the most common variation. Now, if I go back and we stay in the Yugoslav attack, maybe we have to play bishop to c4, and that's another common move. So I'm going to go into that, and it looks like this is the dragon main line, but this is another option. And I'll play this out a little bit, but those are your two options: castle more quickly, or continue development, bringing this bishop up. So what are the possibilities here? It looks like black normally continues their development with bishop to d7, and this also frees up the half open c file for the rook, which could line up on this unprotected bishop. So now we have the castling to the queenside move anyway. And something else that makes the Sicilian defense potentially very complicated is a lot of theory. And you have to kind of experiment if you're going to play the Sicilian defense and figure out, if you don't mind trying to memorize a lot of theory, or if you do not like that, then you'll have to experiment with different lines, and which I'll do future videos on different lines other than the Sicilian dragon, and that way you can kind of see what you like, what you don't like. I used to play nothing but the Sicilian defense against e4 with black for many years, probably I don't know, at least 10 years straight. All I would play is the Sicilian defense. But as I tried to work my way up to more difficult competition, I kind of and I got older as well. So when you're younger, you might want to take more risk. You like more action, but I wanted to play it safer as I started playing more difficult opponents. So the Sicilian defense, you might have good luck if you're playing against an equal or lower rated opponent. But you have to remember, if you're playing higher rated opponents, they are more likely to have memorized more deeply. They know the lines better, unless you catch them off guard. So that's why I only played the Sicilian. So I tried to get deeper into the lines, and sometimes it would help me, and I would catch people, off guard. But then other times they would just be better prepared than me, and I'd end up losing. So it's double-edged. The Sicilian gives chances for both sides, whereas if you play, e4, e5, both of you play the king's pawn opening, well, white's just going to have a slight edge because they move first, and the game's going to be kind of more symmetrical and maybe a little bit harder for each side to get the win, but white will have a kind of an edge from the beginning. But as soon as you play the Sicilian, it unbalances things immediately and kind of gives chances for both sides. So the Sicilian might be a good opening if you have to go for a win with the black pieces. All right, so where are we at here? We just castled queenside. So now the most common move is this, rook to c8. So these are common themes. You bring the rook over here on the half open file, and you're aiming at the king. So sometimes the rook will be sacrificed for the exchange of this knight here, and it'll wreck the pawns on the king side. That is if the queen can't capture and prevent you from breaking your pawns up. But also, the issue here is that the rook is lined up on this unprotected bishop here. So, that could be a potential issue. There might be, some kind of threat here of taking the knight, discovered attack on the bishop on c4. And if the queen tries to capture and protect the bishop, well, then you might have a discovered attack possibility once this knight moves and the dragon bishop is unleashed on the queen there. So there are a lot of tactics and things to watch out for. So you have to kind of work on the theory more and study the variations if you want to play these complicated lines in the Sicilian. There are some lines in the Sicilian as well that are not so crazy and tactical. So that's why I say that you probably have to just experiment with different variations if you're going to play the Sicilian, or if you're playing against it, to see what works for you. All right. So here the most common move is to drop the bishop back here, get it out of the line of fire of this rook. And now what? It looks like knight to e5 is the most common move. So you bring your knight more into the center here. So there might be a threat of moving here, forking the bishop and the queen. And that would kind of force the trade here of bishop captures the knight, rook captures, so that's a possibility. And now, one of the common themes in the Yugoslav attack. H4 is the most common move played here. So you start, bringing this pawn storm online, threatening to, push forward. Of course, you might have to be careful when you do that. At the moment, the knight is guarding that, but you don't want any surprise attacks on your queen, and if this pawn can be captured, which it can't yet at the moment here. But white is going to try and storm up the board here, get an attack going. So h4 is the most often played move. Now h5 could be played. The second most common move is this. So I'll kind of play this out first. We have bishop captures because of that fork by the knight that I mentioned. And now the rook recaptures. So now the most common move is to continue the attack with h5 here. So if knight captures, well, now you have g4 driving that knight back to where it was, and then the bishop plays up here trying to exchange off. Now, a common theme also, or a strategy that can be played in the Sicilian dragon, is to get this rook moved earlier maybe. So then if that rook is able to move to e8, well, then the bishop could drop back here. Now if that happens, of course, you could just get rid of that rook. That's a possibility. But that is something to keep an eye out for. You could get your rook to e8 and then have the option of not trading off this valuable dragon bishop, which can aim down towards white's king in the future and potentially cause some attacking issues, or give some problems for white. Okay, so let's continue on here. All right, here the most common thing is what? Wow, looks like knight takes e4, attacking the queen. And then here, let's see, what do they recommend? Queen up to e3 is played most often. If you have knight takes e4, that's usually better for black. So it looks like the best move is that, queen to e3, rook takes c3. So that's what I was talking about earlier, this attack, sacrificing the exchange, breaking up white's pawns. And now what do we have here? It looks like knight to f6 is the best move, and now the bishops are exchanged, so the king recaptures. Now if we look at the position here, what do we have? It looks like 5 pawns for white, but then black has 7 pawns, so black is ahead by 2 pawns, but there's the exchange, the rook versus bishop and 2 pawns, so overall material is even. But what has white achieved here? Well, there's this possibility of delivering a check here. The half-open h-file could cause issues, so let's see how the game continues. It looks like rook to h2 is played most often, but the other possibility could be this move. You just attack. So king, where up to h8 is played most often. So king to h8. And now, what next? They recommend knight to e2. But, if you go here, the knight could block, And, is that enough? Let's see. It looks like that's not normally played. And this just gives you an idea of how complicated and tactical the Sicilian dragon can be. I'll have to pull up an example game, and then we can see what could possibly have been played. So let me go back to the beginning here, and I'll run through it real quick just as a review. So E4, C5, we have the Sicilian defense. Now, the knight, why was this brought up? To help fortify this D4 pawn push, where white wants to place both his pawns on central squares. And, this is a common move. You play this move to prevent this pawn from harassing the knight when it develops here to F6. So we have the the queen pawn push to D4, and immediately that's captured, leaving, after this recapture, black with the 2 central pawns, white with 1. So remember that in this opening, white wants to use his lead in development and try and just generate some type of attack, whereas if pieces are just traded off passively and we go into an end game, black could have an edge there, especially in the center, having 2 pawns versus white's single pawn. That could be an advantage for black in the end game. So normally you have the attack on this pawn on E4, the knight develops and defends it, and now we have G6, the dragon variation, where you prepare to fianchetto the bishop, and that bishop can be very valuable attacking through the center towards the queen side. And so this move is the start of trying to set up the Yugoslav attack. You're basically developing this bishop here, preparing to make a battery with the queen and bishop and try and trade off the dark squared bishops. So bishop develops, and now black is, pretty much ready to castle kingside. So white plays this move, F3, to prevent any harassment on this bishop. Game continues with castling to the king side. The queen steps forward, creating that battery. Now you're ready to try and trade off these bishops. So knight develops, putting some pressure on this knight in the center. And now castling can be played here. Or did I also say bishop to C4 could be played? So we might as well take a look at the castling option. So now the only problem with this move is that freeing D5 pawn push can be played here, and sure enough, that's the most common move. So this is something else you'll have to work on if you think you want to play the dragon or play against it with white. So here you want to go ahead and take with the pawn. Usually it's a good idea to capture first with the least valuable piece, instead of attacking with the knight. So after capture, the dragon bishop is unleashed here. We have a capture, and here you have this possibility. Capture, pawn capture. So the pawns have been broken up on the queen side here for black. They're left with 2 isolated pawns, but now you have an open line down the half-open B file that could be used for an attack on the white king. And often the white king wants to move over to the B file anyway. So here, with that being open, that could be a little more dangerous. So what next? Now we normally have what? Bishop to D4 played, countering this dragon bishop. So here E5 is played often, and apparently, well, you can't take that. that's no good, or the bishop could just capture. And looks like bishop up to where c5 is the most common move. So now you're targeting the rook. So what do they recommend here? Well, rook to e8 can be played. And is that best? They do say that you may also play this move, bishop to e6, to help back up your knight. So things are already getting kind of crazy here. If we go with the most played moves, apparently it's that. Well, now knight to e4, and what next? Black would save the rook, and once again the common h4 move, starting an attack. Well, now h6 or h5 could potentially be played. They recommend h6. The pawn storm commences here, bringing the pawn up to g4. And I'll play this out a little bit further. That way you can get an idea of how it might go. So queen to c7. g5, you could immediately push forward here. Now that would allow this, which kind of closes things up. Bishop develops here, attacking. Rook at e to d8 kind of lines up on the queen, so that could be dangerous. That leads to queen to f2. Knight jumps into the outpost on f4, and now we have some exchanging. Bishop captures. Knight takes, and now there's an attack on this bishop. So bishop up to d6, attacking the queen. Queen kind of counters our queen. An invitation to trade. Also lining up here, if a rook could jump in here, although at the moment this bishop could capture. So what now? Looks like c3 is the recommendation, which keeps this knight from jumping into the center there. And after that, I won't go any further. It looks like white has the edge here and won in all 5 of these games. So, I'll kind of wrap this up. Just remember that if you're going to play the Sicilian, it's a great opening. If you're trying to go for a win with black, definitely try out the Sicilian defense. But there are so many variations in the Sicilian. There's a lot to learn. But don't be discouraged. Just pick a variation, play some games with it. Try some other different variations, see what you like and what you don't like. And you never know. You could find a chess opening that you want to use for your entire career, for many years. All right. Well, feel free to leave comments. Just remember that I'll do future videos. I'll kind of dig into other variations and some more on the Sicilian dragon as well, because there's not just the Yugoslav attack. And also I'll play some games by famous players. I just wanted to kind of show you the database and give you some ideas of common moves. But I should definitely play some Sicilian dragon games from famous players in the future as well. So feel free to leave comments. I always enjoy hearing what viewers and subscribers have to say. Let me know what you think. Also, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.